The rain had been falling since dawn, the ordinary October rain of Yorkshire, grey and patient, when the young steward lifted the glass case from its shelf and found it locked. He turned it over in his hands, the way a man turns over a coin whose currency he does not recognize. The brass dulled to the color of a old November light, the silver chain gone black at the clasp, the whole small object no longer than his thumb. A dog whistle, he might have called it, had he not seen the two letters engraved along its barrel, worn nearly smooth, EF. This wasn't on the list, he said, more to himself than to her. The old woman did not look up from her chair by the cold hearth. She had been sitting there since he arrived that morning with his ledger and his careful, apologetic manner, the manner of a man sent to price a dead man's house. No, she agreed, it would not be. The solicitor said everything in the library goes to settle the accounts. Books, cases, the globe in the corner. Everything, she said, except that. He set it down as though it had grown warm in his palm. Outside, the rain thickened against the tall windows, and somewhere beyond them, past the wet lawns and the black hedges, a bell rang faintly for the half-hour. He was young enough to still find silences uncomfortable, and old enough to know better than to fill this one carelessly. "It's very worn," he offered at last. "Hardly worth cataloguing at all, by weight of metal." "No," she said again, and there was something in the flatness of it that made him glance at her properly for the first time, not as an obstacle to his inventory, but as a woman who had once, presumably, been young in this house, though it seemed to him now impossible to picture. She sat with her hands folded, her dark dress buttoned to the throat despite the fire he had lit for her eyes on the case rather than on him. "It is worth nothing at all, Mr. Pruitt. That is precisely why it will not be sold." He did not understand her, and said so, gently, the way one speaks to the very old or the very grieved, uncertain which he was addressing. She was quiet a moment longer. Then, unexpectedly, she smiled, not warmly, but with the dry, private amusement of someone remembering a joke no one else had been present for. 39 years ago, she said, I came to this house to catalogue its books, much as you are cataloguing them now. I was 21, my father 3 months in his grave, and I owned, besides the clothes I traveled in, 1 good pen and a very poor opinion of my own prospects. The steward set down his own pen. There was a dog in this house then, she said, that every man on the estate had been ordered to avoid, and was, within the week, to be shot. Mr. Pruitt did not ask why. He had learned, in the 6 weeks since the funeral, that certain silences in that house were not to be filled, only waited out, the way one waits out weather. He watched her instead, the way she held herself very upright in the chair that had been the Colonel's, as though she had not yet decided whether she was entitled to it. Cerberus, she said, an Irish wolfhound, 11 years old that autumn, and taller at the shoulder than most men's ribs. He had belonged to the Colonel's brother, who was killed at Waterloo, and since that day the dog had answered to no one, not the grooms, not the huntsman, not the Colonel himself, though he never said as much aloud. She reached for the poker, then thought better of it, and let her hands return to her lap. I was told, on my first evening, to keep to the west wing and the library, and under no circumstance to cross the stable yard after 4 o'clock. I was told this by the housekeeper, a Mrs. Hollis, in the tone one uses for warning a child away from a well. A pause. I was 21, and recently orphaned, and had exactly £14 a year, standing between myself and the parish, Mr. Pruitt. I did not think the dog the most frightening thing in that house. Outside, a cart passed on the gravel drive, its wheels loud in the wet October air, and somewhere beyond the windows a rook called twice and was answered. She did not look toward the sound. She had, he was beginning to understand, a way of holding herself apart from the present moment entirely, as though she were listening to 2 rooms at once, this one and another, 39 years gone. The library was in a shocking state, she went on. Books piled 3 deep on the floor, damp climbing the north wall, and among them a great many volumes no one in that house had opened since the wars. I catalogued what I found, sermons, ledgers, a treatise on drainage, that I confess held little interest for me. Her mouth moved, briefly, toward that same dry amusement. And a cavalry manual, much handled, with a young man's hand in the margins, not the colonel's hand, though I did not know that yet. She stopped there, as though she had walked to the edge of something, and chosen, for the moment, not to step over it. The dog was to be shot on the Friday, she said instead. I arrived on the Monday. That gives you, Mr. Pruitt, some notion of how little time there was for anyone to change his mind about anything in that house, least of all its master. Mr. Pruitt set down the ledger he had been holding, and did not immediately pick up another. Outside, the rain had thickened against the tall windows, and somewhere below in the kitchen garden, a gate swung and struck its post twice, a small domestic sound that seemed, in that particular quiet, almost an interruption of something sacred. He glanced at the glass case on the shelf behind her, the whistle inside it dulled with age, brass gone the color of weak tea, and then back at the old woman, who had not glanced at it at all. She did not need to. He was beginning to understand that she carried its position in the room the way one carries the position of a door in a familiar house, without looking. 6 days, he said, testing the number, as though it might rearrange itself into something less severe. 6 days, she agreed, and 4 of them wasted on my part, learning where the damp had ruined the spines beyond saving. She folded her hands. I did not come to that house to save a dog, Mr. Pruitt. I want that understood plainly, before you form some notion of a young woman, arriving with a scheme already formed. I came because the Dowager offered £14 a year, and I had buried my father 3 weeks before, in October, in ground that was still soft from digging, and I had nothing else. The plainness of it struck him more than any grief might have. She did not dress the fact in feeling. She set it down like a weight measured and recorded, the way her own father, he supposed, had once recorded distances and gradients along a rail cutting that had, in the end, killed him. He thought of asking after her father, and did not. Something in her posture told him the question would not be answered, only acknowledged and set aside, as she had set aside so much else in the telling. The colonel met me at the door himself, she said, before he had thought to ask that either, which the housekeeper later told me was unusual, that he left such things to her, as a rule. He looked at me the way a man looks at an item delivered to the wrong address. He said, she paused, and for the first time her voice took on something harder, something closer to the cold she must have felt that morning, 39 years gone. He said the dog would not be my concern, and that I was not to go near the stable yard under any circumstance, as the animal had already cost him 3 grooms, and he did not intend to lose a cataloguer as well. She let that sit in the room a moment, unhurried. I gave him my word, she said, and within the week I had broken it. The rain went on against the glass. Mr. Pruitt found he had stopped writing altogether. You broke it within the week, he said, not quite a question, and she inclined her head, as if accepting a small wager won. The library was in a state that would have shamed a lending house, she said. Books shelved by size, rather than subject. Damp along the north wall, where a gutter had failed some years before, and no one had thought to mend it before the damage was done. I began there, at the north wall, because ruin does not wait for anyone's convenience. She said this the way she might report weather. I catalogued for 3 days without once seeing the dog. I heard it. Everyone in that house heard it, at all hours, a sound less like barking than complaint, if an animal can be said to complain. Mr. Pruitt found his pen again, though he did not write. On the 4th day, I came to a shelf of military texts, poorly bound, ex-army stock most of them, sold off after Waterloo for whatever they'd fetch, a training manual for the cavalry, drill and picket duty, that sort of thing. The spine was cracked in a particular place, as books are when someone has opened them again and again to the same page. She reached, without seeming to notice she did it, toward the glass case beside her chair, though she did not open it. There was handwriting in the margins, a young hand, impatient, the ink gone brown. Notes on commands, not spoken commands, but sounded ones, whistled ones. 3 notes, in a particular order, for a dog trained to carry messages under fire and not startle at the guns. Captain Faircliff's hand, Mr. Pruitt said, and she looked at him with something like approval for having arrived there unprompted. I did not know that yet, she said, I only knew the hand belonged to someone who had trained an animal to obey sound rather than sight or scent, which is a particular kind of patience, and I have always had a weakness for evidence of patience in other people. A small, dry humor moved through the sentence and was gone before it could be called warmth. I copied the 3 notes onto the flyleaf of my own notebook. I told no one. I had given my word about the stable yard, you understand, and I intended, in my own fashion, to keep it exactly as long as it suited me. Outside, the rain had thinned to something almost apologetic, ticking rather than falling, and in the pause that followed, she seemed for a moment to be listening for a sound the house no longer made. Mr. Pruitt did not ask what it had been. He had begun, without quite deciding to understand that the answer would arrive in its own time, in its own order, 3 notes, and not one before the others. She did not, however, go to the dog that same evening. This she stated plainly, as though anticipating that he might imagine otherwise, might picture some immediate triumph in the fading light, with the rain still ticking against the glass. 4 days passed between the copying of the notes and the attempt itself, and she wished him to understand that the interval was not idleness but arithmetic, a weighing of what she risked against what she might, in the smallest possible way, be permitted. She had given her word about the stable yard. She had not given her word about the walled garden, where the dog was chained on fine mornings within sight of the kitchen windows, and it was there, on the 4th day, a Thursday, with the frost still silvering the cabbage stalks and her breath showing in the air, that she stood at a distance of perhaps 15 paces and did nothing at all for the better part of an hour. She wished to be looked at first. That was the whole of her strategy, if it could be called one, to be seen standing still long enough that stillness itself became a kind of introduction. The dog had watched her, she said, with the particular contempt animals reserve for those who have not yet earned the right to be noticed, and she had accepted the contempt as fair payment for the privilege of being tolerated. Mr. Pruitt found himself leaning forward slightly, though the ledger in his lap had gone unmarked for some minutes now, the pencil resting where he had set it down without deciding to. And then, he said, and then nothing, that morning. She permitted herself a small pause, not for effect, he understood, but because the memory itself required it. I whistled nothing that day. I only stood, and let him grow accustomed to my standing, the way one lets a horse grow accustomed to a saddle, before ever placing weight in the stirrup. My father taught me that, in his own trade, that the ground must be surveyed before it is trusted, and trust is not a leap, whatever the poets claim. It is a series of small, unremarkable measurements, taken in order, none of them impressive on its own. She looked, for the first time since he had entered the library that afternoon, toward the window rather than at him, though there was nothing beyond it now but the wet lawn and the gray line of the hills where the colonel's grandfather had once planted a row of limes. The whistle came on the 5th day, she said, not the 4th, whatever is remembered in the kitchens even now, if anyone down there remembers it at all. The 4th day, I only stood in the cold and let a dying man's dog decide, on his own time, whether I was worth his notice. She turned back to him. I have never since begrudged anything the time it required to become true. Mr. Pruitt had stopped writing altogether. His pencil lay across the open ledger like a dropped bridge, and he seemed, for a moment, to have forgotten why he had come into the room at all. The crates waiting in the passage, the auctioneer's man due from Leeds on Thursday, the whole cold arithmetic of a house being sold out from under its own memory. 5 days, he said, as though testing the number for weight. That is not what the guidebook says, the one the vicar wrote, for the church fete. It says the dog answered her the moment she whistled. The vicar was not there, she said. Very few people who tell this story were there. She did not say it unkindly. She said it the way one corrects a surveyor's chain that has been laid a foot short, a fact restated, not a wound reopened. Outside, the rain had thinned to a mist that clung to the window glass without falling, and somewhere below, in the kitchen garden, a gardener was cutting back the last of the roses along a wall that had not been repointed since before the old colonel's father died. On the 5th day, she went on, I did not bring the whistle out of pride, or courage, or any of the words that get attached to a person afterward, once the ending is known. I brought it because I had run out of anything else to offer him. I had stood in the cold 4 mornings running, and he had looked at me the way one looks at weather, something to be endured, not answered. I thought, if this fails, I will at least have failed honestly, with the tools that were actually in the house, rather than any I invented for the occasion. She moved to the case then, though she did not yet open it, only rested 2 fingers against the glass above the whistle's dull curve, the way a person touches the rail of a ship before crossing a gangway they have crossed 100 times before, and yet never quite trust. "There is a particular sound a whistle makes in wet air," she said, "flatter than in dry. My father taught me that too, without meaning to. He used to whistle for the chainmen across a cutting, and the note changed with the weather, the way a man's voice does not. I did not know, that morning, whether the dampness would carry the pattern true. I only knew the manual said 3 notes, and that Captain Faircliff's hand had underlined the 3rd with more pressure than the other 2, as if he had learned, at some cost, that men forget the last instruction first. Mr. Pruitt glanced toward the case, then toward her, waiting, the way the household staff must once have waited at the edge of the stable yard, not quite believing a dog with the run of the county for 11 years would answer a woman it had never smelled the hand of before. She did not tell him, that morning in October, what it cost her to stand at the edge of the stable yard with her shawl already damp through at the shoulders, the grooms watching from the safe side of the gate, as though she were about to walk into water rather than mud. The dog had been chained since dawn, on the colonel's order, so that the shooting might proceed without further injury to anyone paid to prevent it. She remembered the chain most, not its weight, which she never touched, but its sound, the particular dragging clink it made each time the animal shifted its haunches and turned its great gray head toward the house, as if it still expected someone to come down from it who never would again. She had practiced the pattern twice in her room the night before, quietly, into a folded handkerchief, ashamed of how much she wanted it to work, and unwilling to let the wanting show on her face where anyone might read it. The book had not promised success. It had only recorded a method, the way a ledger records a debt without promising it will ever be paid. "I did not walk toward it directly," she said to Mr. Pruitt now, her fingers still resting on the glass. "One does not walk toward an animal that has already decided what a stranger's approach means. I stood where I was and I whistled, low, the way the manual described, not a call for attention, but a call for position, as a picket dog is taught to hold ground until commanded further. I did not know if it would understand me as a voice worth minding, or simply as noise." She paused, and in the pause Mr. Pruitt found himself holding his own breath, though he could not have said why a woman past 70, describing an event 39 years settled, should command that kind of stillness from him. "It stopped pulling against the chain," she said. "That was the first thing. Not obedience, merely attention. And attention, Mr. Pruitt, is the whole of what any training is built upon, whether in a dog or a man. I whistled the 2nd note, and it sat. I whistled the 3rd, the one Captain Faircliff had underlined so heavily the nib had nearly torn the page, and it lay down entirely, its head between its paws, watching me the way one watches a door one has been waiting a very long time to see open again." She lifted her fingers from the glass at last. "The grooms did not cheer," she said. "I remember that distinctly. They only looked at one another, and then at the house, where a curtain had been moved aside in one of the upper windows, and did not move again for some minutes." Mr. Pruitt glanced toward the window as though the curtain might still be there, 39 years having done nothing, in his imagination, to the shape of that house, or the weight of that watching. "Whose window was it?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew, and she did not trouble to answer the question directly, which was, he was beginning to understand, itself a kind of answer. "I did not go to the house that afternoon," she said instead. "I returned the dog to its run, though it no longer required the chain, and I went back to the library, because there were 4 crates of sermons still uncatalogued, and the dowager had made it plain that my wage was not paid for the taming of animals." A dryness entered her voice here, not quite humor, but its ghost. "I confess, I found the sermons considerably less interesting than I had the day before." "But he saw," Mr. Pruitt said, "the colonel, from the window." "Someone saw," she said. which was not a denial. It was not until supper. I took mine in the housekeeping room, you understand, not at the family table, whatever liberties the dog had begun to grant me, that Mrs. Hollis came to inform me the colonel wished to speak with me in the library, at 9, and that I was to bring the manual with me. She said this without inflection, but Mr. Pruitt, who had spent 6 days now learning the particular grammar of her silences, understood that 9 o'clock had felt, to a girl of 22 with 14 pounds a year and no father living, very much like a summons to a tribunal. "Were you afraid?" he asked, and regretted it, because it was the kind of question one asked children, and she looked at him with the faint, tired patience of someone who had been asked worse. "I was aware," she said, "that a man does not summon a cataloguer of books at 9 in the evening to discuss binding repairs. I was aware also that I had, without his leave, handled an animal he had ordered destroyed, using a dead man's handwriting as my authority. Whether that constituted impertinence or usefulness was not, I thought, a matter I could safely guess at." She turned from the case at last, her hand falling to her side. "So I brought the manual, and I brought as much composure as I could assemble on short notice, and I went down." Mr. Pruitt found he had set down his pencil entirely, the inventory forgotten on the table between them, the crates of the estate's remaining books, standing about the room like patient, indifferent witnesses. "And what did he say to you?" he asked, "when you came in?" She did not answer at once. She was looking, he noticed, not at him, but at the door. The door of the study in 1832 had been ajar that evening, she remembered, and the light beyond it had been the color of weak tea, low and reluctant, as though the house itself had begrudged the lamp its oil. She had stood in the corridor a moment before entering, listening to the small domestic sounds that persisted even in a house gripped by crisis, a clock somewhere striking the half-hour, the settling creak of old timber, the distant complaint of a door in wind. She had thought, absurdly, of her father, who used to say that a house in trouble sounds exactly like a house at peace, and that this was the cruelest thing about houses. He did not look up from his desk, she said now, to the room in 1871, to the young man waiting with his forgotten pencil. He had a ledger open before him, though I do not think he was reading it. Men, in that condition, often hold a ledger the way another man might hold a hat, merely to have something in the hands. She paused. He said, "Sit," without troubling to specify where, so that I stood a moment deciding whether he meant the chair by the fire or the one nearer the desk, and whether the choice itself would be read as some manner of statement. Mr. Pruitt found himself smiling faintly at this, though he suppressed it when he saw she had not. "I sat nearer the desk," she said. "I judged it the less presumptuous of the two liberties available to me, since I had already taken the greater liberty of the dog." She folded her hands. He did not speak for what I believe was a full minute, though it felt considerably longer. Then he said, and here she stopped, as though testing the sentence's weight, before permitting herself to lift it. "You will tell me now whether you did this to prove something to this house, or to me." The steward waited. Somewhere beyond the tall windows, a rook complained twice and fell silent, and the crates of books seemed, in that pause, to lean fractionally closer, as inanimate things do when a room holds its breath. "I told him," she said, "that I had not thought of the house at all, nor, if he would forgive the plainness of it, very much of him either, that I had thought only of a large, unhappy animal who did not know the words being used to condemn him, and of a page in his brother's hand that seemed to me worth more than a Friday's convenience." She looked at the glass case again, briefly, before returning her gaze to the door. He did not answer that at once. I remember, I could hear the dog breathing in the passage outside, quite calm, quite patient, as though he too were waiting to learn what would be done with the two of us. Mr. Pruitt set down his pen, though he did not seem aware of having done it, and when he did answer, "My lady," she did not sit, though a chair stood near enough for a woman of her years to have taken it without shame. She had never, in 39 years, learned the habit of sitting when a thing mattered. He said, "A page." Only that, at first, as though the word itself were an accusation he could not quite level. Then he asked to see it. She paused. I confess, I had expected anger. I had prepared myself, walking down from the gallery with the manual under my arm, for a scene, for him to fling it into the grate, perhaps, or to tell me that a dead man's handwriting was no business of a hired woman's fingers. I had rehearsed, God forgive me, a small speech of defense. It was never used. The rook outside had gone silent for good now. Only the wet tick of the gutters remained, counting some private arithmetic against the sill. He read it standing, by the window, in poor light, and would not let me light another candle for him, though I offered. I have thought since that he did not want illumination. He wanted the dimness. Wanted, I think, to read his brother's hand the way a man reads a letter he has already memorized, using the eyes only to confirm what the heart has long since settled. She touched the edge of the case, not opening it, merely resting 2 fingers there as though checking a pulse. When he had finished, he asked me a second question, and this one he did not weigh first. He asked whether the dog had ever, in the 6 weeks before my arrival, refused food from a groom's hand entirely, or only bitten when cornered. A curious distinction, said Mr. Pruitt. Not curious to a soldier, she said. He was asking whether the animal was mad, or merely unanswered. There is a difference, Mr. Pruitt, that men who have commanded other men in poor conditions understand better than gentler households ever will. She drew her hand back from the glass. I told him I believed the second. He said nothing to that either, only closed the manual, quite gently, as one closes a door on a sleeping child, and asked where I had learned to whistle in that particular register, since it was not, he said, a sound taught to young ladies of surveying families. And you told him? I told him my father had taught me to call sheepdogs on the moor above the cutting, when I was 9, because he had no son to do it, and would not have a shepherd think less of his daughter for the lack. She allowed herself, briefly, something that was not quite a smile. It was the first true thing either of us had said to the other that was not, in some fashion, about the dog. Mr. Pruitt set down the ledger he had been pretending to consult, and looked at her as though the room had shifted slightly on its foundations. You make it sound almost ordinary, he said. An exchange of confidences over a dog manual. It was not ordinary, she said. It was October, and the fires had not yet been lit properly in that wing, and I remember my hands were cold the whole while I spoke. One does not forget the cold when one is also frightened of saying too much. She moved from the case toward the window, where the gray Yorkshire light lay flat across the lawn, and for a moment she seemed to be looking not at the present grounds, but at some version of them, 39 years gone, muddier, less kept. He did not thank me for the sheepdog story. He was not a man who thanked easily, not then. But he asked, 3 days later, whether I thought the dog might be led to the stable yard without a rope, and I understood that he had turned my answer over in his mind, the whole of that time, the way another man might turn over a debt he was unsure he could honor. Did you tell him yes? I told him I did not know, which was true, and which he seemed to prefer to false confidence. He had had a great deal of false confidence given to him by other men, Mr. Pruitt, in Spain, and after it, and he had learned to distrust it as one distrusts a bridge that has already given way once beneath a friend. She paused at the window, one hand resting lightly on the sill, and her voice, when it came again, had dropped a register, as though she were speaking now more to the glass than to him. The grooms would not go near the dog by then. 3 men bitten in 6 weeks will do that to a household. Mrs. Hollis had taken to crossing herself when she passed the kennel, which I thought a great absurdity in a Protestant housekeeper, though I did not say so at the time. What did you say? I said very little. I went to the kennel on the 4th morning, before anyone had thought to stop me, with the manual under my arm, and my father's whistle pattern in my mouth, and I did not tell the colonel I meant to go. She turned from the window then, and something in her face had gone very still, very deliberate, the look of a woman approaching a memory she had rehearsed many times, and trusted herself to carry only so far. He found out afterward that I had gone alone. He was not pleased about it. He told me so, later, in words I have not forgotten, and will not repeat to you today. Mr. Pruitt waited, pen motionless above the page, sensing that whatever came next had waited longer than he had. The morning had been gray and close, the kind of October morning that presses down on a household like a wet hand. And she remembered the smell of the kennel yard before she remembered anything else. Straw gone sour, wet stone, the copper tang of a dog that had not been washed in weeks because no one would go near enough to wash it. She had worn her father's old coat over her own, the sleeves too long, rolled twice at the cuff, and she had told herself this was practical and not a kind of armor, though she had known even then it was both. The manual had been heavier in memory than it had been in fact. A small thing, calfskin gone soft at the corners, the pages foxed and smelling of pipe smoke that was not her own. She had read the whistle notation 40 times in 3 days, in the cold library after the fires were banked, mouthing the pattern without sound because she had not trusted herself to make the sound aloud until she stood before the animal that would either answer it or kill her for trying. I did not know if it would work, she said now, and the admission seemed to cost her something even after 39 years, as if honesty about fear were a debt she still owed. I want you to understand that. I was not certain. I had reasoned my way to a probability, and I mistook it, as the young often do, for a certainty. Mr. Pruitt said nothing. He had learned, in the 4 days he had known her, that her silences were not gaps to be filled, but rooms to be entered quietly, if at all. The dog was chained at the far end of the run. It had not eaten what they left it. It watched me come the way a soldier watches an approaching column he cannot yet identify as friend or enemy. She paused. I gave the first note. Nothing. I gave the second. It lifted its head. I gave the third, and it stood, and it came to the end of its chain, and it sat. She said this last with no flourish at all, the way one might report a column of figures that had finally balanced after a long evening of error. I have told that part before, to others, and they always want the drama of it, the growl, the bared teeth, the moment of danger past. There was none of that. There was only a very tired old animal recognizing, after 17 years, a language it had been taught by a hand that no longer existed in the world, offered to it again by a stranger who had no right to know it. She reached out and touched the glass of the case, not opening it, only resting her fingertips against the cold surface, as though testing whether it too remembered. That is when the trouble began in earnest, she said. Not before. Before was only fear. What came after was worse, and slower, and it is the part he never forgave me for enjoying. Mr. Pruitt did not ask what she meant by enjoying. He had learned, over the 4 days he had spent in this library with her, that the old woman's sentences were built like locks. One waited for the mechanism to finish before pressing further, or one got nothing at all. She let the silence stand a moment, then went on, her voice dropping into the register of someone recounting a ledger she had memorized long ago and never needed to check again. The housekeeper was the first to say the word, Mrs. Hollis. A good woman, mind. I bear her no ill will, not now, not for years. But she had been 30 years in that house and had never once seen the dog rise for anyone, and here it was, rising for a girl who had arrived on a Tuesday with one trunk and a reference from a curate. She used the word bewitched to the cook, who used it to the second groom, who used it eventually to everyone, including, though he would not have admitted it in those terms, the colonel himself. She turned from the case and looked at the tall windows, where the October light had gone the color of weak tea. He did not accuse me outright. That was not his manner. He asked me, instead, whether I had known the animal before, whether my father, God rest him, 6 weeks in his grave by then, had perhaps done work near the kennels, had perhaps fed it, had perhaps some acquaintance with it, that I had failed to mention. He asked this very calmly, standing exactly where you are standing now, Mr. Pruitt, with his hand on that same shelf. Pruitt glanced down at his hand, still resting on the third shelf from the door, and did not move it, though something in him wanted to. I told him the truth, which was that I had never seen the dog, nor the manual, nor the house before the previous Tuesday, and that the explanation for what he had witnessed was sitting in a crate, not 4 feet from where he stood, waiting to be catalogued like everything else he owned. She allowed herself the ghost of something that was not quite a smile. He did not believe me. Not that day. He believed the whistle before he believed me. And it took him some while yet to separate the two, to understand that a woman might know a thing without having stolen it, might have earned a skill the way he had earned his rank, through nothing more mysterious than attention. She paused, and for the first time in the telling, her hand strayed toward her own throat, as though searching for a chain that was not there. That was the part that undid him faster than the dog ever had, she said. Not that I could command the animal, that I could be in his own house, in front of his own servants, and require nothing from him in exchange for it. Mr. Pruitt had stopped writing altogether. The ledger lay open across his knee, the pen resting in the gutter of the page where he had abandoned it mid-word, and he seemed, for the moment, to have forgotten that he was paid by the hour to be indifferent to what he catalogued. Required nothing, he repeated, as though testing the phrase for a hidden clause. Forgive me, but that seems— He stopped himself. Convenient, she offered. For the story. Yes, it would be, if it were the whole of it. She rose from the chair by the window, slowly, with the particular care of a woman whose joints had begun to keep their own counsel, and crossed to the case where the whistle lay under its film of dust and glass. She did not open it. She only looked, the way a person looks at a debt still owed, rather than a thing possessed. He asked me to leave the house that same evening, she said. Not in anger. He was very correct about it. He said the arrangement had become unsuitable, that a woman who could produce such an effect upon an animal, and upon his staff, and upon him, was not a woman he could employ in the ordinary way, and that his aunt would be written to about a replacement. He dismissed you. Mr. Pruitt's voice had gone flat with something between disbelief and offense on her behalf, 39 years too late to matter. He tried to, she said. It is not the same thing. She touched the edge of the case with one finger, then withdrew it. I told him that I had been hired to catalogue a library of 1,100 volumes, that I had, at that point, catalogued perhaps 200, and that I did not consider a dog's obedience sufficient cause to abandon a contract entered into in good faith for £14 a year. She turned from the case at last. He had not expected to be refused. I do not think anyone had refused him anything since Vittoria. And he accepted it, your staying. He said nothing at all, she said, which, in that house, in those days, was very often the same as consent, though I did not yet know to read it that way. I only knew that he left the library without another word, and that Mrs. Hollis, who had been listening at the door in the manner housekeepers imagine themselves undetected while doing, did not look at me again that night, nor the next morning, nor for some days after. She sat again, folding her hands with the deliberate economy of a woman rationing her own strength. It was the 5th day, she said. There were 6 left before the dog was to be shot, and I had by then made an enemy of the housekeeper and a mystery of myself, and gained nothing certain except the animal's trust, which was not, at that hour, a thing I had any use proving to anyone but myself. Mr. Pruitt had stopped writing altogether. His pencil lay across the open ledger like a small fallen branch, and he was watching her, with the particular stillness of a man who has forgotten he is being paid to catalogue rather than listen. You said gained nothing certain, he said, but you kept the dog's trust. Surely that was something. A dog's trust is a private currency, she said. It buys nothing in a house. I had learned that much from my father, who trusted surveyors' chains and spirit levels and very little else, and who died owing £4 to a man in Leeds for a coat he never wore, because the weather turned before it was finished. She said this without inflection, the way one recites a sum already reconciled. I did not imagine the household would take my word over their own eyes. They had watched 3 grooms bitten. They had not watched me stand in the yard with a whistle in my mouth. But they must have seen it eventually. They saw the dog quiet, she said. Quiet is not the same as convinced. A servant convinced of witchcraft does not require proof of witchcraft, only the absence of a better explanation, and I had not yet given them one. She glanced toward the window, where the October light had gone the color of weak tea. That was the trouble with the 5th day. I had the manual. I had the handwriting. I had not yet shown either to a man who might have believed me, because he had not spoken to me since the library, and a woman does not walk into a colonel's study uninvited to explain herself, whatever her convictions. So what did you do? I did what my father would have done with an unsolved measurement, she said. I went back to the source. I returned to the shelf where the manual had been catalogued, third from the end on the east wall, bound in calf gone soft at the spine, and I read it through again by candle, past the hour a companion is meant to keep, looking for anything I had missed the first time. A second pattern, a variant call, some proof beyond proof, because I understood, even then, that being right in private was not the same as being believed in public. She paused. I found, on the inside cover, a line I had not noticed before. Not a whistle code, a date, and beneath it, 3 words in the same hand. Mr. Pruitt leaned forward slightly, the ledger forgotten entirely now. What words? I will come to that, she said, in the tone of a woman closing a drawer, not slamming it. It matters less what was written than what it made me do. The following morning, which was the 6th day, with 5 remaining, and the Colonel, for the first time since my arrival, in the stable yard before breakfast, watching. The stable yard, that 6th morning, held the particular cold of October before the sun has decided whether it will trouble itself to appear at all, a cold that sat in the stones and rose up through the soles of one's boots, rather than descending from any visible sky. She remembered the smell of it still, wet straw, and the ammoniac sharpness of the stalls, and beneath both, fainter, the tallow of a candle. Someone had let gutter out too near the tack-room door. He had not summoned me, she said. That distinction mattered to him, I think, more than he would have admitted. He had simply come, as a man comes to watch a thing he expects to fail, so that he might say afterward he had witnessed it honestly. Mr. Pruitt said nothing. The pen had gone still in his hand some minutes ago, and he seemed, now, to have forgotten it entirely, as though the ledger before him belonged to a different and less urgent century. The dog was chained at the far post, where they had moved him after the business with the second groom, she went on. He did not look at me when I entered the yard. He looked at the Colonel, the way a soldier looks at the officer who has already signed the order for his own execution. Not with hatred, you understand, but with a terrible, patient attention, as though waiting to be told the sentence was a misunderstanding after all. She drew a slow breath, and for a moment the room, the shelves half stripped, the crates half filled, the gray Yorkshire light lying flat across the floorboards, seemed to recede from her entirely, replaced by that other yard, that other morning, 39 years gone, and yet, in the telling, no distance at all. I did not go to him at once, she said. That was the discipline of it. My father used to say, a surveyor's first error is always haste, that a man in a hurry measures the ground he wishes were there, not the ground that is. So I stood at the gate a full minute, perhaps longer, doing nothing whatever, while the Colonel's patience, which was not inexhaustible, began visibly to fray. What did he say? Mr. Pruitt asked, though he seemed almost reluctant to break the surface of it. He said, You mean to stand there until Friday? I collect. She permitted herself something that was not quite a smile. I did not answer him. I had learned, by the 6th day, that silence was the only currency he respected, because it was the only one he spent himself. She rose, then, with the slow deliberation of a woman for whom rising had become its own small ceremony, and crossed to the window, where the light fell gray, and even across her hands. And then, she said, I put 2 fingers to my lips. Mr. Pruitt had gone quite still, the account book forgotten against his knee, and she was aware of it the way one is aware of a held breath in a quiet room, not by any sound, but by the absence of one. I had practiced the pattern until my mouth ached, she said, in the still room, at night, with a candle burning low so that Mrs. Hollis should not see the light under the door and think me at some mischief. 3 notes. Long, then short, then long again, with a particular falling of the voice on the last that the manual described as the recall, urgent, not to be mistaken for the halt. She touched her lips now, unconsciously, as though the memory lived there still, beneath the skin. I had never had occasion to use it upon anything more obedient than my own 2 hands. She did not turn from the window as she spoke, and Mr. Pruitt understood, without being told, that she preferred it so, that the gray light and the drive beyond it were easier to address than his face, which she must have known wore, even now, the particular hunger of a young man, waiting for a story to arrive at its point. The dog was 30 feet off, she said, chained to the ring by the stable door, and the groom who held the chain, a boy named Sims, I believe, though I would not swear to it after so long, had gone white as tallow, expecting, I think, that I should be the fourth attack rather than the first success. A pause. I did not blame him for expecting it. I had rather expected it myself. And the colonel? The colonel, she said, had come out onto the step by then, though I had not heard him. He moved very quietly, for a man with a cane, when he chose to. And he was watching with the particular stillness of a man who has already composed, in his own mind, the sentence he intends to say to you once you have failed. She let that rest a moment, unhurried, the way she had let every hard fact of the tale rest before handing it over, as if testing its weight before deciding he might bear it. I whistled the pattern once, she said. The dog's ears came up before the second note had finished. By the third, he had gone still in a manner wholly unlike the stillness that had gone before it. You understand, Mr. Pruitt, there is the stillness of an animal deciding whether to bolt, and there is the stillness of an animal remembering something it had been told to forget it knew. It was the second kind. She turned from the window at last, and there was in her face, for the briefest instant, not the composure of an old woman recounting history, but something nearer to the girl who had stood at that gate, waiting, uncertain, and entirely unwilling to let it show. He did not come to me at once either, she said. He looked first at the colonel. Mr. Pruitt did not move. He had learned, over the past hour, that stillness of his own was the price of hearing the rest of it, and he paid it now without complaint, his pen resting flat across the half-filled page of the inventory, as though even its small scratching might interrupt something that could not be repeated once broken. The colonel did not move either, she went on. I had thought, foolishly, I think now, that he might step forward, call the dog off, or call it to him, some assertion of the ownership he had spoken of so bitterly not an hour before. He did neither. He stood at the edge of the stable yard with his cane planted in the gravel, and his jaw set in that particular way that meant he had decided, in advance, not to be moved by whatever happened next. And I confess, Mr. Pruitt, I found that harder to watch than the dog's teeth had been. She crossed back toward the case, though she did not open it again. Her hand merely rested on the glass, light as a moth settling. The dog looked at him for the length of perhaps 3 breaths. I counted them, absurdly. One does, in moments like that, fix on something small so as not to fix on the thing that frightens you. 3 breaths, and then he turned from the colonel entirely and came to me and put his head against my knee, as though he had done it every day of his life, and this were merely the latest instance of an old habit, nothing remarkable in it at all. And the colonel, said Mr. Pruitt, very quietly, as if he feared the question itself might close the case again, said nothing, she said, for a long while, nothing at all. I have since come to understand, though I did not understand it then, standing in that yard with a wolfhound's head heavy against my skirts, and my own heart going like a drum, I was certain the whole household could hear, that there are silences a man keeps because he has nothing to say, and silences he keeps because he has a great deal to say, and does not trust a single word of it to come out as he intends. His was the second kind. She looked, briefly, toward the tall window and the gray light beyond it. I did not know that yet. I only knew that he had gone the color of a man who has just watched something he believed dead walk back into the room, and that he left the yard without a word to anyone, and did not send for me again for 2 full days. 2 days is not a long stretch of time, Mr. Pruitt, unless one spends it in a house where one has been given a wage and a task, and no further instruction, and does not know whether one is still employed or merely still present. She said this without bitterness, as though reporting a fact of weather. I catalogued. I ate my meals in the small parlor off the kitchen, where Mrs. Hollis set my plate down without meeting my eye, and I did not go near the stable yard, because I did not think it my place to go where I had not been asked. The dog, I was told by one of the grooms, the youngest of them, a boy called Tuke, who had not yet learned to be afraid of me the way the others were. The dog would not eat unless someone stood near the gate of the run, not touching it, simply near. She paused, and Mr. Pruitt did not fill the pause, having learned by now that she would return to it in her own time. On the third morning, she said, a note came to my room by the hand of the housekeeper herself, which told me something, though Mrs. Hollis's face told me nothing at all. It asked that I attend the colonel in the library at 11 o'clock, and it was signed only with his initial, and I remember standing at the small looking-glass in my room, deciding whether to change my collar, and deciding against it, because I did not wish him to think I had dressed for the occasion of being dismissed. "Were you dismissed?" Mr. Pruitt asked, though he must have known, from the whistle under glass not 6 feet from where he stood, that she could not have been. "No," she said, "I was not. But I did not know that when I knocked at the library door, and I want you to understand that I walked in that morning prepared to be told I was no longer wanted, and had already composed, in my head, the sentence I would use to ask for my 14 pounds in lieu of notice, because I did not think I could trust my voice to ask for anything more." She smoothed a fold of her skirt, an old economy of movement that seemed to Mr. Pruitt less like nervousness than like the closing of a ledger column. "He was standing at the window when I entered," she said, "not seated, which was itself unusual, for he preferred, in those days, to receive people from behind a desk, as though the wood between them were a kind of fortification. And he did not turn around at once. He said, to the glass rather than to me, that he had been reading, and here she stopped, and something in her face suggested she was choosing, with great care, which word to give next, as though the word itself still cost her something, 39 years on. He had been reading, he said, his brother's hand. Not a letter. There were no letters left worth the name, he added, with a dryness that was not quite bitterness, but the manual, the one she had catalogued 3 days before, and shelved, she thought, without particular ceremony, under military science, continental campaigns, a category she had invented herself, because the house had none. He had taken it down. She had not asked him to. She would not have dared. He turned from the window then, she said, and his face was doing something she had not seen it do before, a kind of arithmetic, as though he were adding a column that would not close. He held the manual open to a page she recognized by the shape of the stain in its corner, a ring left by a cup set down carelessly 40 years before, by a hand that was no longer living. He asked her whether she had known, when she used the whistle, what the notation meant. She said she had read it as she read any hand, for its grammar, not its ghost. He did not smile at that, she told Mr. Pruitt, but something in his jaw eased that had not eased since she had arrived, 6 days before, into a house that smelled of wet wool and old smoke, and a grief nobody named aloud. He said the dog had not eaten from a groom's hand in 11 years. She said she was aware. He said, and here her voice changed register slightly, dropping, as though quoting required a lower key, a different instrument, that he did not know what to do with a woman who had solved in 4 days what 3 surgeons, 2 trainers, and his aunt's chaplain had failed to solve in as many months. He did not say it warmly. She was careful to tell Mr. Pruitt that. It was delivered the way a man delivers an inconvenient fact about weather or debt. Mr. Pruitt, who had stopped pretending to write anything in his ledger some minutes before, asked what she had said in return. She said, "Nothing wise." She said she had told him the dog was not obeying her, it was obeying the pattern, that she had merely been patient enough to learn what his brother had already taught it, years before either of them had cause to grieve him. And that, she said, was when he closed the manual. Not sharply, not as a man ending a conversation. He closed it the way one closes a door in a house where someone is sleeping, she said, and he did not look at her again for the length of nearly a full minute, during which the fire in the grate settled once, audibly, and neither of them moved to mend it. Mr. Pruitt looked, at that moment, like a man who had forgotten there was a ledger at all. She noticed it and did not comment on it, only reached for the shawl at her shoulder, as though the room itself had grown colder in the retelling. She said that was the first time she understood something about him that no one in the household had thought to explain to her, that his silences were not withholding. They were arithmetic. He was a man who had spent 17 years subtracting a name from every room he entered, and he did it so quietly that people mistook the subtraction for coldness, when in fact it was only grief practicing economy. Mr. Pruitt asked, carefully, whether she had known that at the time. She said no. At the time, she had only known that a fire had settled once in a grate, and that a man had closed a book the way one closes a door, and that she had stood very still, because some instinct, not learned, not taught, simply old as breathing, told her that to speak in that minute would have been a kind of trespass. She said the dog had known it too. Cerberus had lain by the hearth through the whole of it, ears low, watching the colonel with an attention she had not seen him give to any other person in the house, not even her, as though the animal understood, in whatever manner animals understand such things, that the man standing over the manual was not simply irritated by what a stranger had accomplished, but was being made, against his will, to remember. She told Mr. Pruitt that grief, properly withheld, looks very much like temper to those who have not been trained to read it, that she had been trained, in her own fashion, by a father who buried a wife young and never once raised his voice about it, only grew quieter with each year, until the quiet itself became a kind of eulogy. She said she recognized the shape of it in the colonel before she recognized anything else about him, recognized it the way one recognizes a chord struck in a room next door, not the notes, only the ache. Mr. Pruitt set down his pen entirely now. She said that was the evening she stopped thinking of her employment at Faircliff Hall as a wage to be earned, and started thinking of it, though she would not have used the word then, would perhaps have been ashamed to, as a vigil she had, without asking to be chosen for it, somehow been asked to keep. Outside, the light had shifted further toward gray, and somewhere below in the house a door opened and closed, ordinary and unremarkable, the sound of someone continuing a life that had nothing to do with the one she was describing. Mr. Pruitt asked, at last, whether that was the day she went to the kennels, the fourth day, the day the manual's markings had settled in her mind long enough to become a plan, rather than a curiosity. She said it was not quite that simple, and then, as though catching herself in a small vanity, admitted that it was exactly that simple, only she had not wanted to say so plainly, because plain simplicity, in a woman's mouth, is so often mistaken for immodesty pretending at humility. She had gone down before the house was properly awake, while the frost was still hard enough to whiten the cobbles, and she had not told the housekeeper, and she had not told the grooms, because she had learned already that a thing announced beforehand invites an audience, and an audience invites failure dressed as spectacle. She went alone, with the manual under her arm wrapped in a square of oilcloth against the damp, and she stood some 6 feet from the run where the dog was chained, and for a long while she did nothing at all but stand. That, she said, was the part no one ever wished to hear about, the standing. They wanted the whistle, the obedience, the drama of a savage thing, made gentle in the space of an hour, as though an hour were the whole of it. But the hour was only the visible portion, the way the tip of a nail is the only part one sees driven into wood. The length of it, the part doing the actual holding, remains unseen. She had stood in the cold long enough that her feet lost feeling in her boots, watching the animal watch her, before she ever lifted the whistle to her lips. She wanted him to grow tired of expecting her to flinch. Mr. Pruitt said nothing, only looked toward the case where the whistle sat, as though trying to reconcile the small tarnished object with the scene being described to him. She noticed the look and did not comment on it directly. Instead, she said that it was a curious thing, how an object could hold an act inside it the way a shell holds the sound of a sea it no longer touches, that anyone might pick up the whistle and see only brass gone dull, a maker's mark, 2 initials, and never once hear the cold of that morning, or the particular silence of a dog deciding, for reasons of its own, to stop straining at its chain. Mr. Pruitt asked, carefully, whether the colonel had watched from the window that whole time, or only come to it near the end. It was the kind of question a younger man asks when he wants the shape of a scene, without asking outright what it meant. She did not answer at once. She crossed instead to the case, though she did not open it, only rested 2 fingers against the glass above the whistle, as one might touch a pane of ice to see whether it would bear weight. He had watched the whole of it, she said. She had known it without turning. the way a person in a cold room knows when a door has opened somewhere behind them, not from any sound, but from the shift in the air. She had not looked toward the house until the dog's chain lay slack upon the gravel, and its great head had come to rest, unbidden, against her knee. Only then had she raised her eyes, and found him already standing at the library window, one hand braced upon the frame, not moving, not calling out, watching as a man watches a thing he has been told all his life was impossible, and finds he does not know what to do with the sight of it now that it has occurred. She said she had thought, in that moment, that he looked less like a colonel than like a boy who had been shown a conjuring trick he could not account for, and resented the wonder of it even as he felt it. Mr. Pruitt smiled faintly at that, and she allowed the smile to stand a moment before continuing, because it was, she said, very near the truth of him, a man who distrusted anything he could not have predicted, and distrusted himself for wanting to believe it anyway. She had gone in that evening expecting reprimand. She had rehearsed, walking the length of the gravel path, a defense involving the manual, the markings, the plain mechanical fact of trained response to trained sound. Nothing supernatural, nothing owed to her person at all. She had been prepared, she said, to be dismissed for insolence, for overstepping what a hired cataloger of books was permitted to attempt with a gentleman's dying dog. Instead, she had found him at his desk, the manual open before him to the page in his brother's hand, his finger resting upon the 3 notations of the whistle pattern as though he were reading a letter long delayed in the post. He had not looked up when she entered. He had only asked, in a voice she had not yet heard him use, whether she had known, when she lifted the whistle, whose hand had written down the notes she followed. She had told him no. She had known only that the hand belonged to someone who had loved the dog enough to write patiently, in pencil gone soft with handling, exactly how loyalty might be summoned back from an animal too grieved to offer it freely. She had not known, until he told her, that the hand was his brother's. He had closed the manual then, she said, with the particular care of a man closing a door he did not intend to open again that night, and he had not spoken further of it. But the following morning the dog had been led into the library, and had lain by the hearth as though it had always been permitted there, and no one had troubled to remark upon it, which was, in that house, the nearest thing to a blessing. Mr. Pruitt had stopped writing some minutes before. The ledger lay open on his knee, the last entry unfinished, the ink drying to a faint brown at the nib. "And the whistle," he said. "You never told him you meant to keep it." "He never asked," she said. "That was his way of giving things, without the asking, so that nothing could be refused him in return." She rose, slowly, one hand upon the arm of the chair, and crossed to where the glass case stood among the crates the auction house had not yet claimed. Through the dust-clouded pane the whistle showed dull gold, its engraving worn nearly smooth by thumbs other than her own. His, she supposed, in the years before hers. "It was never a gift," she said, not turning. "A gift may be declined, or lost, or sold, and no one the poorer for it. This was a debt. He paid it in the one currency he trusted absolutely, because it was the one thing left to him that he could least afford to lose, and he gave it anyway." She lifted the small brass key from its ribbon at her throat, fitted it to the lock, and drew the case shut again, though it had not been open, testing only that it would hold. "It does not go with the rest," she said. "Mark it so in your ledger, if you like, or mark nothing. Some accounts are not meant to close, Mr. Pruitt, only to be kept." She did not explain further. She did not look at him again before she left the room, and the young steward, sitting alone among the crated books in the fading gray light of that October afternoon, understood that he had been shown something he was not meant to fully understand, only to record, faithfully and without comment, that it had once